I'm a female in my late 20s, and this happened fairly recently. Nothing bad happened to me, but I'm lucky it didn't, and it easily could have. There's a conservation area that I used to like to walk in regularly. It's beside a golf course, near an ordinary subdivision just off a busy road, and is popular with dog walkers, photographers, and nature enthusiasts. The conservation area is fairly well maintained and alerts its users that there are hidden cameras everywhere. My point in bringing attention to all of this is to say that, by all accounts, this is a very safe, ordinary, urban wooded area in a populated area. One big thing about me is that I like isolation to recharge. I dislike crowded trails, so by convention I go in off-peak hours or when the weather is unpleasant. Not dangerous, just unpleasant, too cold, lightly raining, foggy, etc. I stay safe, but I like there to be as few people around as possible. In the city, in daylight, I don't feel like I'm taking any risks by doing this. There was one day that I went around 4 p.m. or so on a frigid, rainy Monday in November. On days like that, there are maybe only 1 or 2 dog walkers, but today there was no car in the parking lot except for a dirty blue pickup truck with a man sitting in it. I noticed that he was looking at me, but that didn't really bother me. I was just happy to see the trail was empty. On this particular day, I went to the area to practice my navigation skills. I was learning how to use a compass at the time, and it's good to practice that skill in an area where you won't get lost. So I decided to go off the trail to a big pine plantation, which is a big open area with large mature pine trees. If you're not familiar, it's not a hiking area, or really that interesting in any way, and definitely off-trail. You wouldn't get there unless you really wanted to get there. I picked my first landmark and sighted it using my compass, then started pacing towards it. I found myself about halfway there when I heard rustling through the bushes. I turned around, and I saw the man from the dirty blue pickup standing there, entering the pine plantation. He was in his mid-50s, white, a little pudgy, wearing a baggy beige cardigan and blue slacks. I felt pretty alert at this point. It felt out of place somehow. I took note of it, but pretended to keep walking with my compass, because I didn't want to seem weird. I looked at him. He pretended to ignore me. I was getting a really bad gut feeling about the situation for some reason. At this point, I felt like he was following me, but I have an anxiety disorder, so I try not to freak out for zero reason. I don't want to ruin my relaxation time. It's just a guy walking around, no big deal. To see if he was following me, I pivoted 180 degrees and walked directly towards the trail again. He was still following me. I walked through the bushes onto the trail. He was still following me. By this point, I was freaked out. The pine plantation entrance is only about 50 feet from the trail, so this guy would have walked 50 feet, entered the pine plantation, and then decided that was it for the day. Bad odds, definitely following me. I quickly exited the trail, and when I'm leaving the parking lot, I see that he's still looking at me. I took the long way home. The experience freaked me out, and I only visited the area once more before the second encounter. This time, it was January. I wanted to go bird watching. A week prior, I'd seen an owl in the same pine plantation. I was practicing navigation again and wanted to see it again. I'd seen it about an hour before sundown, so I figured that was a good time to try to see it again in the same area. I checked the parking lot, and there was no blue pickup truck, but there were 2 other cars with men. One was a red sedan with heavily tinted windows, and it looked like the other one was empty. So, I went on the trail again. The area should be totally empty. Good. Unfortunately, not. About 20 feet into the trail, I heard footsteps behind me. I don't like when people walk behind me, but it's not a crime, and I'll lose them soon. When I go to the pine plantation, I'm sure you know where this is going. When I walk into the pine plantation, I hear the same rustling of the bushes as before. I turn around and see the same man from before. I feel a wave of terror and dread overcome me. Alone in a muddy forest with a possible stalker. But it still felt so calm, so mundane. To confirm my fears, I walk over to the area where I saw the owl last week and pause to look for it. Who do I see next to me? The same freaking guy from before. I'm terrified at this point, and every part of me is screaming to run. So I walk as fast as I can toward the trail again. I pass some random guy in the same pine plantation, and I smile at him, just totally on autopilot. He smiles back. It wasn't until I was in the parking lot that I got freaked out. There was a second person in the same pine plantation. Could they have been connected somehow? I stop briefly in the parking lot and take out a small notepad to quickly write down the license plates of the two cars. This gives the original man time to catch up to the parking lot. I am booking it now on foot out of the parking lot, and he yells toward me, "Can I give you a ride?" I just shake my head and keep walking. As I walk away, he begins to follow me in his car. He waits at the intersection to see which direction I'm going, and I decide to walk through a busy park to lose him. He pulls into a nearby hidden driveway and stares at me. He takes out his phone to presumably take a photo of me, noting which direction I'm walking in. Then he does a U-turn and drives fast the other way. Conclusion. I took the long way home, filled out a police report, and the police opened an investigation on it. I have not gone back to the conservation area since. The experience has definitely left me with an ongoing nervousness about being alone. Doubly so because I don't know who the second guy is. I passed him so quickly, I only know that he was in his mid-50s, had glasses, and was bald. The police unfortunately told me that there's nothing they can really do at this point. So, the best I can do is stay vigilant and try not to let it freak me out too much. Unfortunately, this has totally ruined my love for going out into the wilderness alone. Nothing bad happened, but I think that was more because I was able to escape and lose him, or them, before anything did happen. In summer 2019, my partner and I, both in our early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and then stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We enjoyed camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different to make the most out of our vacation. My partner had never been out of the US, and it seemed like a crazy new experience for both of us. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each stop, and the grand finale was a reserved campsite at Golden Ears, which was really close to the water, Owlet Lake. We packed terribly. I had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruits and veggies to eat healthily, stored them in a cooler that was way too small, and brought a cutting board and knife to break up snacks while driving. We started in California, switching off driving our bright red Ford Fiesta. We drove through Oregon and Washington and made it to Vancouver. We spent a day or two in each state, drank a little too much, and stayed out way too late. Canada was the best part, and Owlet Lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing cold lake, hiked around, and saw a beautiful waterfall where we saw a couple taking pictures of each other for an hour. We started modeling the same poses from afar. Everything was perfect. The campsite was empty except for the other couple, and we went to bed early that night. It was quiet. I woke up to crackling sounds outside my tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black, probably an animal. The crackling continued closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The brightness came on, and I turned it off, almost blinding myself with the light. In those 2 seconds, I could make out a person right outside our tent. I froze and sat up. They weren't moving, and were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. I woke them up and said, "There's someone outside the tent." Then I heard footsteps, quiet footsteps, walking out of our campsite. My partner started saying, What are you talking about?" in a sleepy haze. A truck or a car was parked right outside our camping area. No one was near our campsite. It started up and then drove off. They didn't turn their lights on until they turned the corner and were well out of view. I couldn't really make out much, but it definitely looked like a truck. I was shaking, and my partner couldn't piece together what was happening. I wanted to leave, but the Golden Ears gate locks until about 7 or 8 a.m. It was 1 a.m., so we were going to be there for the rest of the night. We moved to the Ford Fiesta and tried to sleep in the tightly packed car. She fell asleep immediately and thought I was paranoid. Maybe it could have been a park ranger. but it seemed way too weird of behavior for a park ranger. So I ended up sitting there wide awake for about 2 hours, cars locked. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. I was sitting in the passenger seat and my partner was in the driver's seat, fast asleep. It was now 3 a.m. I was half awake when I saw a car slowly driving up the road, its lights off as it rounded the corner. It had to have been the same truck. I was scared, but adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounded the corner and pulled up directly in front of our campsite once again, in the same spot. I felt like I was going to throw up. Outside, I had no weapons, except for that same knife we used for the fruit and veggies, so I grabbed the knife and tried to make myself look angry, crazy, and big. I sat straight up in the passenger seat, holding that knife, keeping it at eye level, and stared deadpan at the truck in the pitch black, just like the farmer in Grant Wood's American Gothic painting. The truck stopped and turned off. A light shone directly into my face from inside the truck. I stared back, terrified, clutching my bright red Ford Fiesta and my large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck started up again, turned on its lights, and they stayed on, blinding me. The truck pulled out, turned around, and went back where it came from. My heart was pounding the entire time. I woke my partner and said, "We need to get the hell out of here." We packed up by throwing things into the car and sat there awake until 6 a.m. We drove home and didn't stop, constantly rehearsing and trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decided we just needed some sleep. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My neighbor Tom and I decided to camp in the woods behind our houses. We set up our tents a few hundred feet apart, hoping to get away from the everyday grind. As night came, I built a fire and sat by it, enjoying the usual forest sounds. I noticed Tom's tent was unusually quiet. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. Around midnight, the forest went eerily quiet. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling leaves stopped, replaced by a strange silence. I heard soft rustling noises coming from Tom's tent. It sounded like someone or something was moving around inside. I figured it was just the night and tried to relax. Then I saw a flashlight beam flickering in the distance from Tom's direction. I thought he might be searching for something. I picked up my flashlight and went over to check if he needed help. As I got closer, I called out softly, but no one answered. The flashlight beam was moving in an odd way. When I reached Tom's tent, I saw it was unzipped, and the flashlight was on the ground, still shining. The tent was empty. My heart started pounding. I looked around, feeling more and more uneasy. The forest was unnervingly quiet again. I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate steps. I turned around, but there was no one there. My gut told me to get back to my tent and call for help. I rushed back, trying to stay calm. I grabbed my phone, but realized there was no signal. I kept my flashlight on and looked around nervously. Hours passed, and the silence fell heavily. Just before dawn, I heard a voice. It wasn't Tom's. It was someone calling for help from the woods. The voice was weak and desperate. I followed the sound, pushing through the thick brush. Eventually, I found Tom. He was disoriented and hurt badly. He had been attacked and knocked out cold. Tom later said he heard someone approaching his tent, so he grabbed the flashlight to check it out. When he stepped outside, someone hit him from behind. He never saw who it was, but his injuries showed the attacker had left him for dead. The police came and searched the area. They didn't find the attacker, but they said it was likely someone local with a bad record. We were lucky to have survived. The worst part was when Tom mentioned seeing dark figures moving around his tent before he was attacked. It felt like the woods themselves had turned against us. We never found out who did this or why. The woods were no longer a safe place, but a chilling reminder that danger could be lurking in the darkest corners. I still get shivers thinking about it and avoid those woods whenever I can. I went camping with my grandmother deep in the woods. She loved being outside and somehow talked me into coming along for the weekend. I wasn't really excited about it, but she always looked so calm out there, so I agreed. We set up our tent near a small stream with tall trees all around us. The first day was pretty quiet. We walked a bit, cooked dinner over a small fire, and watched the stars before heading into the tent to sleep. That night, something felt weird. I couldn't explain it, but the woods were too quiet. No wind, no bugs, just still. I lay there for a while, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was just because we were so far from anything, and I tried to sleep. The next day, we spent most of it walking around, but that strange feeling stayed with me. Every time I looked at the trees, I got this sense that something was watching us. My grandmother didn't seem to notice anything strange, so I didn't mention it. By the time the sun started going down, I was more than ready to go to sleep and just get through the night. While we sat by the fire that evening, I kept hearing odd noises from the woods. It wasn't animals, at least not any I could recognize. The sounds were low, like something big was moving through the bushes, but it never got close enough to see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't want to worry my grandmother, so I stayed quiet. After we put out the fire, we went back to the tent. It was even quieter than the night before. I lay there for what felt like forever, that uneasy feeling growing stronger. My grandmother was sound asleep next to me, totally unaware of how tense I was. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't far from the tent, maybe 20 feet or so, and they were slow and steady. I froze, not moving a muscle, listening closely. The steps circled the tent, not too close, but never too far. This wasn't just some animal wandering by. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking their time. I stayed completely still, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I hoped they had left, but then they started again, this time even closer. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought whoever was out there could probably hear it. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake, listening to every little sound outside the tent. The night dragged on forever, but when the sun finally came up, I was relieved. Tired, but relieved. That morning, we packed up to leave. I didn't tell my grandmother about the noises, but I couldn't wait to get out of there. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something, or someone, was watching us. The woods were too quiet again, and it made me feel like we weren't alone. Just before we got to the car, I noticed something by the tree line. There were footprints. They weren't animal tracks, they were big human footprints, fresh, and they had been right next to our tent. I stared at the prints, my stomach turning. Someone had been out there, walking around us while we slept, watching us. I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, I knew, somehow, they were still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they had followed us the whole time, hiding just out of sight. I realized then that no matter how far we drove, no matter how far we tried to get away, we had been seen, marked, and maybe one day they'd come back. I needed a break. Being a cop can take a toll on you, so I figured camping alone for a weekend would help me clear my mind. I found a quiet spot deep in the woods, far away from the noise of cars and the constant rush of people. It felt like the perfect escape. The first night was calm. All I could hear were the sounds of the forest, leaves blowing in the wind, birds singing, and every now and then a branch snapping in the distance. It was peaceful. The quiet and fresh air were just what I needed. But on the second night, things felt different, wrong even. I set up my tent and got a fire going, but something was off. The forest wasn't as lively as it had been. There were no animal sounds, no breeze, just this strange, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things because of the job. It's hard to fully relax after years of being a cop. You're always alert, always watching. But this silence, it was too much, felt unnatural. At some point, I started hearing footsteps. They were slow, like whoever or whatever it was trying not to be noticed. They were far away, but not too far. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just getting jumpy, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around my campsite, shining the light into the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. I went back to sitting by the fire, staring into the dark woods. I kept waiting for the sound to come back, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. It stayed quiet, and I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, something harmless. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hours passed, and I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent, trying to calm myself down, but then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. I felt this tightness in my chest as I pointed the light toward the trees again. Nothing. Just darkness. But then, as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones circling my campsite. My blood ran cold. These weren't mine. Someone had been here, walking around me while I sat by the fire, watching me. That realization hit me hard. Someone had been out there, maybe still was, watching the whole time. My heart was pounding. I backed into my tent, grabbed my bag and flashlight, and started packing as fast as I could. I wanted out of there. But then I heard it again. Those footsteps. And now they weren't just coming from one direction. I could hear them all around me. I froze for a second, listening, trying to figure out how close they were. Whoever was out there, they were close, and there wasn't just one of them. I could feel the eyes on me from the dark, just outside the reach of the firelight. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my stuff and started heading down the trail. My flashlight shook in my hand. I could hear them following me. Not too close, but close enough to make sure I knew they were there. I walked faster, then started running. The footsteps kept up with me, staying just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear in, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped down the dirt road. Before I pulled away, I looked back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, just where the light from my car reached, were a few dark shapes, people watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I sat in the car for a while, catching my breath. I thought about reporting it, but I knew better. No one would find anything. I've seen enough in my years on the force to know that sometimes the worst things aren't supernatural or from some fairy tale. Sometimes it's just people. And what's scary is those people out there, they knew the woods better than me. They weren't just watching me for fun, they were waiting. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. And what's worse is, I got away. But I have no idea how many others didn't. I've posted this on another thread back in August, but I figured I'd share it again. Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time, for only a few seconds, that I can't explain. I distance hike when I can, and sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes that means walking in pitch dark with a low-light headlamp, and it gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under a canopy of stars more nights than I can even count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trails, riverbanks, lake shores, ridges, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand. I've heard, seen, and smelled everything this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened around 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for maybe another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed until sunrise, and I was on mile 5. I was in a low bottom that was wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I was on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush with young maple and old oak growth. I was focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, completely zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack, and I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. At 4:30 in the springtime, it means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze when fight or flight kicked in. You have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there, balancing myself in silence, was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came, fast. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, that meant get the hell out of here. To describe it as best as I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree, more a fungal bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack, not a thud or a thump. I've described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense it was about 50 yards directly in front of me. It was loud and it was clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I got the courage to move toward the noise, I was going to have my back turned to it and get up that ridge. And that made me very nervous. My head's somewhere between a methane murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes passed. I just breathed my foggy breath into my glasses and listened. Still nothing. Still dead quiet. I've got maybe 20 or 30 minutes until first light. I cranked up the headlamp and started to slowly creep toward the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail, and this definitely didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. Then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter, and this was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made it to the top of that ridge, I was huffing and the first light was showing. But I didn't stop until full light was out and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, especially with leaved-out branches, makes a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I just don't know. I was camping alone, deep in the woods, far from anyone. I had been doing this for years, and I always liked the quiet at night. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It usually made me feel calm, but this time something felt different. I couldn't tell why, but it just felt wrong. It started just before sunset. I was setting up my tent when I noticed how quiet the woods were. Too quiet. No crickets, no birds, nothing. At first, I shrugged it off, but as the night went on, the silence started to bother me. I built a fire and sat by it, eating my dinner. That's when I began to feel it, a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. It was just darkness outside the reach of the fire's light. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. The longer I sat there, the worse it got. I told myself it was all in my head. I was out here alone, far from anyone. There was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't stop the growing fear that was creeping in. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. I figured I'd feel better after some sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, trying to relax. But every little noise outside sounded louder now. Every twig snapping or leaf crunching made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like animals. The sounds were too slow, too careful. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the roof of my tent, listening to the night. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, just outside my tent. They stopped right next to me. I froze, holding my breath, too scared to move. There was nothing but silence. The footsteps stopped, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, barely breathing, for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away slowly, fading into the trees. I stayed still for a long time, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent. I shined the light into the trees, looking for any sign of what or who had been out there, but there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no proof that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard. My heart was still racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up everything as fast as I could, barely taking time to think. I threw my stuff in the car and sped off, not looking back. I never figured out what or who it was that night, but sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet place, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and heavy. It makes me wonder if whatever it was didn't really leave that night. Maybe it's still out there, waiting in the dark for me to come back. About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brewfest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55. Looking for an off-grid camping spot, we drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6 miles before reaching the town. There wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared, walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small, with brownish-gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was, because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no. She was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting, more seriously each time. My girlfriend, sister, and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually, we told her we had to leave and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m., my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and toward our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp, and then I heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, I slowly and quietly unzipped my tent, carefully poked my head out with my gun, and looked toward my truck in the fire. To my surprise, it was a full-grown buck, horns and all, standing there, staring at the embers of our fire like it was trying to warm up. I was relieved, but decided to scare it off. I hit the wall of the tent, half out of the doorway, and yelled, "Get out of here!" To my shock, the deer just turned its head, looked at me, and then back at the fire. It didn't move. I tried again, louder and more animated this time. It slowly turned and started walking toward me, which was extremely unnerving. Deer are usually scared of people and don't approach them. At this point, I was really freaked out. It was a big buck. I quickly got back in the tent, zipped it up, and just waited. The buck walked up to the tent, and I could see its silhouette from the firelight on the tent wall. It stood there next to the entrance to my tent for a good minute or two, then continued snooping around our campsite. Eventually, it wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different, a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I hardly got any sleep, but around 5 a.m., I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek, calling out, "Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired and because it was so creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later, calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, the really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camp down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while. But there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A whole head of brownish-gray hair, like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning, after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer, or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate, took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. I was always close to my sister-in-law, Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together. So when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any town. The drive up was nice, with the trees growing thicker as we went deeper into the forest. The campsite was beautiful, right by a small clear lake. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing night. The first night was calm. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too tired to stay awake. But the next day, I started noticing things that didn't seem right. First, it was small stuff. The sounds of the forest seemed too quiet, like the usual rustling of leaves and animal noises had stopped. Then, as we sat by the lake, I noticed footprints along the shore that weren't ours. They were fresh, leading out of the water and disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to Sarah because I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They were big, too big to be a normal person. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Later that night, as we sat by the fire again, I heard something in the distance, a low, deep sound like a growl. It was faint, but it made me freeze. Sarah didn't seem to hear it, or if she did, she didn't react. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear far off in the woods. But the feeling that something was wrong only got stronger. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. It all seemed louder, closer. I lay in my tent, staring up at the darkness, listening, waiting for something, anything. Then I heard it again, the growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps were coming from just outside the tent. They were slow, careful, like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy breathing, deep and rough, like something big was just inches away. I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too scared to move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the night. I didn't dare move until the first light of morning. When the sun finally came up, I rushed out of the tent. The ground outside was messed up with large prints pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tent back into the woods. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could, neither of us saying a word to each other. We left the campsite as quickly as possible, neither of us looking back. On the drive home, the silence between us was heavy. We both knew something had been out there, something watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but we never went camping again. The fear of whatever was in those woods, of what we might have run into, was enough to keep us far away from the wilderness. To this day, I still think about those footsteps, that breathing, and wonder what was out there. What if we hadn't left when we did? What if it had decided to come into the tent? I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what could have happened is enough to keep me from ever going back. But the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake. Whatever was out there came from the water. Now, every time I see a quiet lake, I wonder what might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next chance to come ashore. I've always liked the peace of camping. Being out in the wild by myself makes me feel free. This time, I planned to camp for a few days alone, so I found a quiet spot near a small lake deep in the woods. The only sign of other people was a tent set up a few hundred yards away, a man I had met earlier who called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a bit older, wearing faded camouflage clothes. He mentioned that he used to be in the military, a retired commander. The first day went by without any trouble. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water, staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. At first, I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish, but as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened. So, I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite, calling out, but there was only silence. That's when I noticed something strange, a small patch of disturbed dirt not far from his tent. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, but the dirt had been hastily covered up. My heart started to race, and I felt panic rising. But I tried to stay calm. I found a stick and started to dig. As I cleared away the dirt, I uncovered a shallow pit. Inside were a few items: a knife, a worn dog tag, and a notebook. The dog tag had a name on it I didn't recognize, but it was the notebook that caught my attention. I flipped through it and saw page after page filled with notes about survival skills, old military missions, and strangely, entries about this very camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It described how he'd been following a man who matched my description. It talked about how he was planning to eliminate the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too close to mine. His paranoia, his obsession with this mission, had made him believe I was some kind of enemy. I froze. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, too close. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. My mind raced. He was out there somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment. He might have been ex-military, but something had clearly snapped in his mind, and he decided I was the enemy. I didn't stick around to find out what he planned to do. I dropped the notebook and ran back to my camp. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to show up at any moment, but he never did. The only sounds were my racing heartbeat and the rustling leaves in the wind. I left the forest that night, driving non-stop until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty pushing him to complete a mission that never existed. As I lie awake at night, I can still picture him standing by the lake, waiting. I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target, or if one day he'll track me down again. I know I should forget about it, but there's something in the way he looked at me, something that tells me this isn't over. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's the truth, that he's still out there searching, and that I'll never truly be safe.